The sky over the Tower of London was grey that morning, thick with mist and silence. Even the ravens seemed uneasy, their black wings restless against the wind. It was May 27th, 1541, a date the court would later whisper about, but never write honestly in its chronicles. For this was the morning an old woman, one born to nobility and raised in loyalty, was led to her death for crimes no one could quite define. Her name was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, cousin of kings, daughter of a duke, and the last living link to the royal Plantagenet line. They said the king had signed the order himself. But even among those who hated her, no one truly believed she deserved it. The courtyard was prepared in haste. The block, dark with age, stood crooked in the mud. The executioner, a young man brought in at the last minute, gripped his axe nervously. He had never done this before. No seasoned headsman dared take the task, for everyone knew to spill the blood of a woman so noble, so old, and so innocent was to invite a curse upon one soul. As the gates opened, Margaret appeared. She did not tremble. Her white gown brushed the damp stones, and her hair, streaked with silver, lifted faintly in the wind. To some, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a ghost walking through her own legend. Guards kept their eyes low, ashamed. She had once walked these same paths as an honored guest of the crown. Now she was led as a traitor. The witnesses stood in silence, nobles, soldiers, and frightened servants forced to attend. A priest followed behind her, whispering Latin prayers that disappeared into fog. Margaret's voice was calm. "I am no traitor," she said, her tone clear enough for even the guards at the far gate to hear. "But if my death must feed the king's peace, then let it be so. I shall meet my Maker with a clean heart." Those were words of courage, but also defiance. The priest's hand trembled as he crossed himself. In truth, her so-called crime had been nothing more than being born with royal blood. Her son, Reginald Pole, had spoken against King Henry VIII's separation from the Church of Rome. That was enough to condemn the mother, an old woman living quietly in her estate, as a conspirator. The order was clear. She was to die without delay. But no one had expected this kind of execution. The young executioner hesitated. He looked at her, then at the crowd, waiting for a signal. The old woman refused to kneel. "I will not," she said. "If the king wishes me dead, let him send his servants to take my head as they may." It was not defiance. It was dignity. She was the daughter of a duke, the niece of kings. Her pride was all she had left. The soldier beside her muttered something under his breath, urging her to kneel. She did not move. The crowd stirred, whispers rising like wind through leaves. The executioner swallowed hard, lifted the axe, and stepped forward. Then something happened that history tried to hide in silence. When he swung, he missed. The blade cut the edge of her shoulder. A gasp spread through the courtyard. Margaret flinched but did not scream. The axe rose again and missed once more. Blood marked her white gown, but she stood upright, staring at him as if daring him to try again. Panic filled the boy's eyes. He swung a third time, a fourth. The witnesses turned away. Some began to cry. The priest fell to his knees. And then she ran. For a brief, terrible moment, the condemned woman fled across the scaffold, her gown trailing behind her, as the executioner chased her around the platform, hacking wildly as she tried to escape his reach. The guards froze, uncertain whether to stop him or her. The crowd murmured prayers. Each swing was slower, clumsier, more desperate. By the time it was done, silence had swallowed everything. The fog thickened, hiding her from view. When the mist cleared, she lay still, her face turned toward the gray sky. The young man dropped the axe, shaking, his hands slick with blood and regret. The officer in charge whispered to a scribe nearby, "Write it down clean. Say the sentence was carried out swiftly. No detail." And so it was. History's worst execution, rewritten into polite silence. That night, the execution block was burned, the stains washed with lime, and no priest dared perform the rites. The king dined as usual, indifferent to what he had ordered. But within the walls of the tower, servants spoke of strange things, of whispers echoing through the corridors, of an old woman's steps heard near the courtyard long after midnight. In the years that followed, no one dare mention Margaret Pole's name aloud in the king's presence. But among the people, in taverns and markets and in the secret corners of London, they called her the countess who would not kneel. Her death was meant to erase a bloodline. Instead, it became a wound the crown could never heal. And in that wound, England learned something about fear, about power, and about the price of silence. The story did not end on that scaffold. It was only beginning in whispers and rebellion, in the long memory of those who had watched and wept. For when history tries to bury the truth, it never stays buried for long. The morning after Margaret Pole's execution, the Tower of London was silent. Even the guards avoided the courtyard where the scaffold had stood. The young executioner had vanished. No one knew whether he had fled the city or been hidden by those ashamed of what he had done. But one thing was certain. Something had changed in the air. Those who had witnessed the execution spoke softly, as if the tower itself were listening. By royal decree, her name was to be erased, her estates confiscated, her titles stripped, her memory officially condemned. The king's clerks worked late into the night, crossing her name from the records of the nobility. But history is stubborn. It remembers even when men try to forget. In the royal chambers, King Henry VIII sat alone. The fire burned low. The feast from the previous evening remained untouched. Cold meats, half-empty goblets of wine, and the silence of man who could not sleep. He had ordered many deaths in his reign. Rivals, courtiers, even wives. Yet this one lingered differently. He had received a report saying the execution was done without incident. But rumors traveled faster than ink. By morning, word reached him that the old woman had resisted, that her blood had stained the scaffold, that the people were whispering. She refused to kneel, said his adviser, cautiously. Henry looked up, his face shadowed by the firelight. Then she died as proud as she lived, he muttered. Some are calling it a curse, the man said, his voice almost trembling. They say the countess spoke before her death, that she cursed the king and his heirs. Henry's eyes narrowed. Nonsense, he said, though his tone betrayed unease. Curses are for cowards. But that night, sleep did not come. The wind howled against the stone walls, carrying faint echoes from the courtyard. Some said the king woke shouting. Swearing he heard footsteps dragging across the floor, the soft rustle of silk behind the tapestry. In truth, whether ghost or guilt, something had begun to follow him. Days turned into weeks, and strange misfortunes began to circle the court. The queen fell ill. A favorite horse collapsed mid-ride. The royal treasury was robbed by one of its own guards. Each incident seemed small, but together they formed a whisper of dread, as though fate itself had turned cold toward the king. Yet outside the palace, among the people, Margaret's name grew into legend. In the narrow streets of London, mothers spoke of her courage. Fathers told their sons of her defiance. The phrase she would not kneel became a quiet prayer, a warning against tyranny and blind obedience. In the countryside, travelers claimed they saw her figure at dusk, a woman in white walking by ruined chapels, her face pale and calm. Others said she appeared beside prisoners waiting for execution, her presence softening the edge of death. The church, though silenced by fear, recorded these tales in secret margins of old manuscripts, noting simply, "The countess walked still." For Henry, such rumors were intolerable. He ordered the tower courtyard sealed, its records burned, and any mention of her name forbidden in the capital. But still, her memory persisted, not in books, but in the minds of those who had seen her courage. Among them was a young scribe named Thomas Avery. He had been ordered to document her death, but refused to write the king's version. Instead, he kept a hidden journal beneath the floorboards of his room, recording what he had truly seen: the trembling executioner, the running figure, the horror of the crowd. He wrote, "The axe fell not by justice, but by fear, and fear shall haunt the hand that held it." Thomas's secret chronicle would later be found decades after his death, offering the only truthful account of what happened that morning. It told not of a clean execution, but of a nation watching its conscience falter. Meanwhile, Henry grew more isolated. Those who once flattered him began to avoid his gaze. Even his most loyal nobles felt the unease that followed him into every room. At night, he would summon priests to bless his chambers, burning incense and muttering prayers against evil spirits. But perhaps the most chilling detail came from one of his guards, who swore that late one evening, while standing watch near the royal chapel, he saw a figure moving across the courtyard, a woman in white, walking slowly, head held high. She looked like she was searching for something, the guard would later confess, or someone. He did not speak of it again. In the years to come, Henry's body began to fail him. Swollen, restless, burdened by the weight of paranoia. He saw enemies in every corner, heard whispers in every silence. Some say he died haunted by the memory of every person he had condemned, but none so vividly as the Countess of Salisbury, the woman who would not kneel. When he died in 1547, few mourned him, but even fewer forgot the story that had shadowed his final years. Margaret's children, once hunted, survived into quieter times. Her son Reginald, the one who had defied the king, returned years later under a new monarch. He built churches, tended the poor, and spoke often forgiveness. But when asked of his mother, his voice always softened. She died standing, he said, and that is how England should remember her. Her body was never given a proper burial. No stone marks her grave, yet her memory endures, not carved in marble, but in the quiet defiance of every soul who has faced injustice and chosen dignity over fear. And as centuries passed, historians tried to clean the story, to turn tragedy into formality. But the truth still lingers, not in the official record, but in the whispers that rise with the mist above the tower. Some nights, when the wind blows from the Thames and the ravens grow silent, they say you can hear her voice again. I am no traitor. The words float through time, soft, unwavering, eternal. For the past never truly dies. It only waits to be remembered. Centuries passed. The world changed. Kings rose and fell. Empires burned and rebuilt. Yet the name Margaret Pole never quite vanished. It clung to the edges of history, like a ghost that refused to fade, whispered by scholars, remembered by mothers, and carried in the bloodlines of the silent. By the 1700s, London had grown over its old bones. New walls, new streets, and new rulers stood where the Tudor court once trembled. Yet the Tower of London remained, gray, cold, and watching. Guides spoke proudly of royal victories, of treasures, of prisoners. But when visitors asked about the Countess, voices would lower. Even then, 3 centuries later, her story was told only in half-truths. Some said she was a martyr. Others said she was a witch. A few swore that on certain mornings, when the fog rolled heavy across the Thames, the execution ground turned colder than stone, as though the earth itself remembered what it had witnessed. But the story of Margaret Pole was never just about death. It was about how truth endures despite the silence of power. In the archives of Westminster, a historian named Eleanor Brooks stumbled upon something strange in the early 1900s. While cataloging forgotten Tudor manuscripts, she found a page torn from a ledger, a record of executions. Every line was neat except one, the entry for May 27, 1541, where the ink had been smudged by water or perhaps tears. Next to her name, instead of executed swiftly, someone had written faintly, she would not kneel. Eleanor could not forget those words. She began searching deeper, reading accounts from priests, letters from servants, and the rare, hidden notes of the scribe Thomas Avery. The deeper she looked, the clearer the picture became. Margaret had not been a criminal. She had been a symbol of resistance, punished for her bloodline, her faith, and her unbroken spirit. In an age where obedience meant survival, she had chosen dignity. Eleanor published her findings in a small book few expected to notice, but it spread quietly through universities and libraries. The public began to rediscover the Countess, not as a forgotten victim, but as a woman who, centuries before her time, stood for something far greater than herself. Soon, her name appeared again in plays, in poems, even in whispered tours of the tower. Visitors would stand near the grass where the scaffold once stood, feeling a chill, wondering whether history itself carried memory like a scar. But it was not just scholars who felt her presence. Guards at the tower, men and women of modern times, still told stories of unseen footsteps echoing past midnight, or of lights flickering when her name was spoken aloud. One night in 1961, a beefeater reported seeing an elderly woman dressed in white. Standing beneath the scaffold arch, she looked peaceful, he said. But her eyes were alive, as though she knew I could see her. The guard fainted on the spot. When he woke, he said she had whispered something before fading into the air. Tell them I forgave him. No one could prove it. But after that night, every guard who took the midnight shift made a point of bowing slightly near the courtyard, a small act of respect for the countess who would not kneel. And in that gesture, history found something remarkable. Margaret's story, once meant to terrify and erase, had transformed into a symbol of conscience. Kings and empires had fallen, yet her defiance had survived them all. Not through rebellion or armies, but through truth whispered across centuries. For every historian who read her name, every visitor who stood in that quiet courtyard, the same question echoed. How many voices has history buried? And how many still wait to be heard? Today, when visitors stand for the Tower of London, they rarely notice the small plaque beneath the grass, a modest marker with her name. But if they stay a moment longer, if they let the silence settle, they might sense it, the faint pull of the story too human, too unjust to ever disappear. Margaret Pole was not just a victim of a cruel king. She was a reflection of what happens when truth defies power. Her courage became a whisper in the conscience of every age that followed. In the end, the executioner who chased her became nameless. The king who ordered her death became feared, then forgotten. But the woman they tried to silence, she lived on not in flesh, but in memory, in the quiet rebellion of history itself. Every age has its tyrants. Every age has its victims. But sometimes, when the world forgets mercy, a single act of courage outlives the centuries. And so, when the wind moves across the tower at dawn and the sun catches the stones just right, those who know the story swear they see her there, not as a ghost, but as a reminder, standing, proud, unbroken, because the past, no matter how cruelly rewritten, always finds a way to speak again. The wind over the Tower of London still carries secrets, whispers of power, betrayal, and the quiet courage of those who refuse to kneel. Among them, none stand taller than Margaret Pole. History remembers kings for the wars they fought and crowns they wore, but her legacy was forged in silence, a silence stronger than any sword. In that cold May morning of 1541, when an untrained hand raised the axe against her, Margaret became more than a condemned woman. She became the face of every forgotten soul who met injustice with grace. Her body may have fallen on the scaffold, but her dignity never did. Centuries later, the world still measures justice against stories like hers, moments when truth trembled beneath the weight of power, yet somehow survived. Henry VIII ruled an empire, but it was his fear that betrayed him. Margaret ruled only her conscience, and it never faltered. Time has a way of humbling kings and elevating the forgotten. The palaces Henry built are now ruins visited by tourists, while Margaret's story still moves hearts that seek meaning in the ruins of history. She proved that a single act of courage can echo longer than commands of 1,000 tyrants. When the crowd gasped that morning, they thought they were witnessing the end of a life. In truth, they witnessed the beginning of a legend that would outlast the dynasty that killed her. So when you think of power, remember her. Remember the woman who faced death with eyes unclouded by fear. Remember that history is not written by kings alone. It is written by those who stood tall when others bowed, because courage does not always roar in battlefields. Sometimes it stands quietly on a scaffold, whispering to eternity, "I am no traitor." And perhaps that is why her name still lingers, not as a warning, but as a promise. That dignity endures, that truth survives, and that no crown, no axe, and no empire can ever silence a soul that stands for what is right. The executioner swung his blade. The king wrote his laws. But it was Margaret's silence that history could never erase.